So, all right, I'm going to read some lines from Beowulf in Old English. That is lines, I think, from the translation, it's lines 7. I'm actually going to start at 7, where Grendel came gliding, so it's starting at 7:11. And I'm going to go for about 20 lines. And this is where Grendel comes to the Danish hall, as he's wont to do every night. Only Beowulf is in there for the first time. And so there's some very interesting things about this passage. Grendel is sometimes called by a warrior word, like rink, and which means great battle warrior. And he's sometimes called by a monster name, like Theond, which means fiend. So he crosses categories in this way. And some people have argued that he's like a riddle creature because he crosses categories. He's more dangerous than most riddle creatures. He's a little like Gollum and Tolkien actually used Grendel as a model for Gollum, the Tolkien scholars think. So here he comes out of the darkness. He seems to be part of the darkness, and he comes toward the hall. And as he comes toward the hall, the narrator makes 2 jokes here, which are kind of interesting. 2 of these sort of backhanded Lytodes jokes. So the first one is, that was not the first time that he came to the hall. So that's very funny because he comes every night and he eats a bunch of people. Everyone knows that. So that's a sort of joke told from a Grendelish point of view at the human's expense. But then the narrator says, he never found such hard luck before or after. I mean, his hard luck is that he found Beowulf. So he doesn't have any after, So that's gone, and that joke is a kind of human perspective joke that's told at Grendel's expense. He's called here by different names. One of the names he's called is Aglacha. I told you about this, I think, before. That means awe-inspiring one. And Beowulf is also called Aglacha. So they're both here in this passage, Aglacha, together. In fact, as the passage goes on, it's very difficult sometimes to tell who the poet is talking about of the 2 slightly or terribly monstrous types. Grendel comes to the door. He sees the door from his monstrous perspective as a hall mouth. And so that's a kenning that shows what his perspective is. And there's a rhyme at the end of this first page. I'm only going to read the first page. So, Eodet Iramode, he went angry-mooded, him off Aegum stowed. So there's mode and stowed there. That's very unusual in Old English poetry, but there is an example of it. And then it ends with this wonderful line, out of his eyes stood like a fire, an unfair light. I put this line on the board. For him, off Aegum stowed, out of his eyes stood, not this is something else. Liga Yalikos, like a flame, an unfair light. And James was making the point in the Blackboard posting about the unwords in Beowulf and what they mean, and we can talk about that later, but I actually went back into the Beowulf glossary and counted. There are 43 unwords in Beowulf, and I'll give you some examples of them later. So, anyway, I think that's all I really need to say about this. The lines are chanted according to the stresses, and the system is a little bit complicated. I don't want to go into it now, but I'll do that later in the class. We don't really know. We have a pretty good idea about the rhythm because of the nature of the accented and unaccented syllables and how they fall in the measured lines. We don't have much of a notion of the actual notes that are used. We know that we think that this was played because the instrument that's played in the hall is called a harp, which we get harp from, but it actually is a lyre like this. And so it has the lyre from Sutton Hoo and from several other digs has had 6 strings. The strings are all rotted away, but the pegs are still there. So they played this instrument that had 6 strings, and we think probably meant that they sang the song according to a pentatonic scale, and that there was a repetition of the bottom note in the pentatonic scale in the 6th string. So, if you want to fool around with pentatonic scales, there are lots of pentatonic scales, but one good way to play with it is to try to make a tune using the black keys on the piano. That's a pentatonic scale. There are only 5 of them. Okay. So here we go. Tha kom of Mora, under me sleoðum Grendel gongan godis írvar, muntusum mannsjada mannekinnes, sum nebes írvanin selatham hagen, wod under walkenam, tothast the haywin, wretched gold selegumina, yerost wissa, fatum fine. No, what's that pharmacy? That hey Rothengaris ham yesochta, never hey on hold or dogum ern season, heidrun hella hail thanus fond. Combato wretched rink, see the Andreum umbadella, Durus on arn fear bendum fast. Sit the hair folum macron on bread the beer hidig, the hay bolgan was wretched as mood on rod after done on final floor, found treadoda, ailda irmode. Him of Egan stowed lia ya lead coast leich unfair. All right, so there's the leich unfair. That's the unfair or unbeautiful light. That passage in the poem is where presumably talking up the idea of the unbeautiful or fiery light that comes out of Gollum's eyes. Remember in the movie Gollum sometimes has terrible green eyes, and sometimes he has okay blue eyes. When he's talking in the voice of Smeagol, he has human eyes, but when he's talking in the Grendel voice, he has his green eyes. So this is the translation of that passage. Grendel came gliding out of the moors, up from the marshes, bearing God's wrath. The monster meant to stalk and kill a mouthful of mankind. Under a shroud he slid to the door. Under dark clouds he crept to the hall, the house of giving, the home of feasting. That wasn't the first time he sought Hrothgar's home, but he never found, in his grim days before or after, such bad luck, such hard hall things. The unholy warrior reached the door, separated from joy. The door burst open, its iron bonds snapped with a touch of hands, a mind full of evil at the mouth of the hall. The fiend stalked the floor, swollen with anger, fierce in his fury. Out of his lurid eyes leapt like a flame an unfair light. So that's the passage, and I've tried to catch the rhyme of stowed and mowed, but it's hard to do, and in this line, fury is supposed to rhyme with lurid, and the hall mouth is here in the translation. There's a joke that's only buried pretty deeply in the original here. He meant to stalk and kill a mouthful of mankind. So that's his notion of what these sleeping bodies look like. I think that's all I need to say. There are little things that come in here. Oh, here's the other joke. The house of giving, the home of feasting. Well, they do, of course, have feasts in the hall, but late at night there are no feasts. The only feast that exists late at night is the feast that he makes of all the sleeping warriors. So that's the passage.